Well, good morning and welcome back to the Broadcast Retirement Network. I'm Jeff Snyder, and this is the BRN Sunday podcast. I'm going to be joined today by members of the media, academia, and financial services as we go around the globe to discuss the issues related to retirement, markets, technology, personal finance, and so much more. We've got another great show, so sit back, relax, and enjoy this episode of the BRN Sunday podcast. Let's kick things off with a look at technology. Joining me on the line from West Palm Beach, he's Daniel Klein, Senior Technology and Consumer Products Reporter with The Motley Fool. Hey, Dan, how are you?
I'm good. How are you, Jeff?
I'm doing well, and I should have said also one of the hosts of Motley Fool Live. Is that right? Motley Live?
That is correct. Motley Fool Live. If you're a member, we broadcast from 9 to 5 a.m. doing all sorts of different shows. I actually was lucky enough, my show at 4 o'clock, The Rundown, yesterday, which is kind of like part of the interruption if you're a sports fan. I actually had David Gardner, our co-founder, on, and it was a really good time.
Oh, it sounds like fun. I certainly have to sign up to check it out. Dan, I guess before we get started, I know you want to talk about drones in North Carolina, but I was going to ask you, the football season started off Thursday and really kicks off in high gear on Sunday. What are your thoughts about the NFL?
It's going to look a little weird. So I'm actually surprised I'm surprised we got here. I'm actually kind of impressed that they were able to, to keep people safe enough. The testing has been extensive. It has been good. I think some of the rules are weird. Like some stadiums will have partial capacity. Some will have zero. That doesn't seem all that fair to me. That being said, I'm excited about football. I'm a Patriots fan, and Cam Newton and the whole thing is exciting. That said, the basketball playoffs have been so good that I'm really transfixed by those at the moment.
Okay. Well, I think a lot of people are really curious to see what it looks like with no fans and crowd noise, or maybe there's no crowd noise. I don't know how they're going to do that like they did in the NHL. All right, so let's focus back on tech, even though that is really a tech, in my opinion, a tech concept as well. But let's talk about Walmart jumping into the drone delivery race in North Carolina.
Absolutely. So here's the situation. You're going to hear a lot about drone delivery, and it's not what you think it is. It's not going to be a sky full of drones that's, delivering to your downtown apartment. Drone delivery in at least the let's call it the near short term, the next year or two, is going to be rural. It's going to be areas that are, special situations. Like there's an area called the Villages here in Florida, which is senior citizen housing, and there's been some mass drone delivery to there where stuff is sort of brought to a field and then it's being left, for residents in common areas. So Walmart is testing drone delivery, but don't overhype what that's going to mean. There will be drone delivery. Amazon's going to do it, but it isn't going to be like this, like sky filled with drones that replaces the post office or vans or whatever it is. So it's an interesting story. And Walmart's been a leader in using drones, but they've been using it in their mega warehouses for things like inventory. That's a lot more logical than the idea that I'm going to go out on my porch and get like a burrito or whatever it is. It's so Jeff, I think this is one just like pump the brakes a little bit.
Yeah, well, I was watching iRobot. You're familiar with the Will Smith, Bridget Moynihan show movie, iRobot, and they had things flying all over the place. It's not going to be like that, Dan. It's not going to be like Terminator, where you've got Hunter, whatever they call those ships flying around, right? I mean, this is going to be well thought through.
It is going to be well thought through, and there is a lot. That's hard to say. There is
Sorry
a
about
lot
that.
of legislation that has to happen before this can be a real thing. So right now, it's one of those situations, where the FAA has given very tentative approval for testing. So this is, again, toe in the water, but even when it happens, look, imagine you're in New York City and your Amazon package comes to your window and you lean out and you fall to your death. That's absolutely a scenario that they're thinking about. How this is going to work, what it's going to look like. I don't think we know those answers yet.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Dan, let's shift gears because this week was filled with a little bit of not a lot of market volatility, especially in the tech sector. And I know Tesla, who we've talked about numerous times on this show and on the television network, suffered their worst loss. And I want to get your thoughts about Tesla, but also a little bit more about market volatility and what you're hearing from fools on the Motley Fool Live.
Yeah, so here's what we say. Don't try to time the market. Buy shares of good companies and hold them forever. And, by forever, we mean a minimum of 3 to 5 years. And don't sell unless your thesis on the company changes. So if you believe Tesla is a good long-term buy, then buy shares now that they're down a little bit. It fell 20% in one day, and it fell for a combination of kind of two reasons. One, they weren't added to the S&P 500. There's no rule saying they have to be added to the S&P 500, but the reality is they eventually will be. What happened and why they weren't now is because the stock is so volatile, and a lot of indexes, a lot of different funds buy the S&P 500. So if Tesla's added, they're going to have to buy it, and they don't want those funds exposed to that volatility. So Tesla will be added post pandemic, or at least at a time where its shares are trading at a more predictable rate. It's also worth noting that as much as it lost, it was still trading, a couple hundred percentage points above where it was a few months ago, and it picked up, I think, 6% yesterday. So good stocks might be volatile. You might see an Apple fall just because general tech sentiment is down. Nothing changed about Apple in that period. So it's one of those things where you have to tune it out. What we tell you is don't look at stock prices on a day-to-day basis. Don't even look at your portfolio once a month. Check in on your portfolio once a quarter and ask yourself, why did I buy this? And does that reason still hold? And here's the reality. If you never sell, you're going to be better off than if you're selling often and buying back in. And there's just no way you can know what a bottom is. People say, oh, should I buy the dip? You should buy always. Buy shares of companies you like and spread it out over time. There's no predicting. Your only advantage as an individual investor is time.
You know, dollar cost averaging. I mean, that is the principle that we're talking about here, Dan. And oh, by the way, when you said the apple falling, I thought you were talking about Sir Isaac Newton and the apple hitting his head. Well, Dan, I'm looking forward to having you on the network this week. I know we're going to be talking about 5G ushering FinTech 2.0 and also Amazon's India strategy. I can't wait to have you on to talk about those really important issues. Until then, have a great weekend, and we'll talk to you soon.
Looking forward to it, Jeff. Thank you.
Welcome back. Now, time to take a look at the latest social media trends on the LinkedIn platform, and who better to do that for us but Devin Banerjee. He is the Senior Financial Services Editor for LinkedIn, and he's also the editor of the This Week in Finance newsletter, which of course you can find on the LinkedIn platform. Just click on Devin's name and you can subscribe very easily. Devin, thanks so much for joining us on the program this morning.
Absolutely, Jeff. How you doing?
I'm doing great, and I know you're out traveling, doing a little visiting at the end of the summer. So kudos to you and your wife and your family. I hope everything's beautiful where you are.
Thanks a lot. It's enjoyable, but not so beautiful. We're actually trying to outmaneuver some fires on this drive we're doing up the West Coast. So kind of a scary time for a lot of people. So, if there are listeners out there in California and Oregon, just hope everyone's staying safe right now.
Yeah, absolutely. We certainly echo those statements. I mean, there's just a lot of devastation in a lot of places for a lot of different reasons. Stay safe, Devin. So, just because you're traveling doesn't mean that LinkedIn isn't working around the clock with new stories, new themes. What's top of mind for you and the team this week?
Yeah, it was another busy week on the platform. The team is still cranking pretty hard. The first topic I'm going to mention, Jeff, which I think you'll enjoy, we called it, "Is it time to redefine retirement?" The quote-unquote traditional view of retirement, has been you work until a certain age, you stop working, and then you're in retirement, and that's the phase of your life that you're in. We featured a survey. This was done by Voya Financial. It was going around quite a bit this week that found that actually a majority of people expect to have some sort of job when they retire, and to continue working to some extent through retirement. So retiring from their main career and continuing to have some kind of job. So about 54% of respondents anticipate this so-called non-traditional retirement. About 59% of working baby boomers, who are kind of the closest to this phase of life, expect this for themselves. And what's interesting to me is you would think that this would be driven by financial concerns. And of course that is an important part of it, but that was less than a majority. About 40% said they want to do this for that safety net of unexpected costs and market, volatility and personal financial concerns. The majority of them, almost 60%, said their main reason for wanting to do this is for mental well-being, to continue staying mentally active and intellectually engaged. And I thought that was quite interesting. And I was just curious, Jeff, as I know you focus, a lot more on the planning and designing of these retirement systems and plans, but just anecdotally, I was curious if this was surprising to you or if it kind of makes sense.
Well, I think, look, anytime you can hear through surveys what people are thinking at a certain period of time, I think that's very instructive. I think it's intuitive. I think, we're learning. We're learning from living longer. And it's not, by the way, it's not just the U.S. I know the Voya survey probably was more focused on U.S. Individuals, but I mean, I think it's the case where around the world we're living longer. And so, the reality is retiring doesn't just mean you're going to check out in 10 years, right? You're going to live for at least another 25 to 30 years if you have good, decent health. And look, I think it makes a lot of sense. And I also agree with you from a mental point of view. I think there's a lot of research that has been done about Alzheimer's, dementia, and the importance of staying active mentally and physically and what that means to your overall well-being. And I think the last thing I'll say, Devin, and this is about what you guys are doing, not necessarily about what I think, of course, but I think that this could actually doing these steps could lead to people extending lifetimes beyond just 30 years in retirement. I mean, we could live beyond 100, 105, 110. I'm not necessarily advocating that I want to do that, but I think it means a lot. It says a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. And a lot of people on our platform also pointed to some other good news in the survey, which is that even though there's been all this economic uncertainty and a squeeze on households, and actually maybe because of that, people are still prioritizing savings. So a majority of respondents, 55%, said they'd actually rather save more for retirement than be completely debt-free right now. And 70% of participants in Voya plans, according to Voya, have increased their contributions to retirement plans during the course of these past 5-6 months of this pandemic. So, some good news there that saving is still top of mind for people. In fact, even more so.
Absolutely.
Another topic I'm going to mention that was really, really popular this week. A lot of companies operate on these review cycles, and around this time of the summer, it's often a promotion time. We at LinkedIn ran some data, though, that's finding that during this deep recession that we're in, despite the recent rebound in hiring that we've been seeing, the pandemic is still hindering job promotions, actually, particularly in certain industries. But across the board in the U.S., promotion rates were down almost 40% as of August compared with the same period last year. As I said, that's even as the hiring rate is recovering a bit. We're certainly seeing companies just trying to keep the belt a bit tight, and promotions right now are just not top of mind and not necessarily on the table. Among the hardest hit industries when it comes to this promotion rate that we studied, recreation and travel, which of course is not that surprising. Hardware and networking, so IT, energy, of course, not so surprising there, energy and mining, and then transportation and logistics as well. Where we did see promotion rates hold quite resilient and not fall so much year over year was actually education, manufacturing, construction, and financial services. So, this maps quite cleanly with our other data that we do, the Workforce Confidence Index, where we're seeing confidence in these industries among people as they think about their career outlook and their jobs outlook. But just across the board, as I said, almost 40% decline in promotions this past year. And you're seeing this in the news. Some of the larger companies have publicly declared kind of pauses, or the news has come out that they have put in place promotion pauses. So Google has put one of those in place, did so in March. It said it would last until November. We've seen Dell, Quest Diagnostics saying, again, internal promotion freezes that will run at least to the end of the calendar year. So, a difficult time, of course, for people to be recognized right now. But again, just understanding companies' trade-offs and budgetary constraints, basically, that's what's happening right now.
Yeah, look, I mean, all you got to do is turn on the news and watch the stock market. I mean, the volatility that we've seen, as you've reported, I think last week on the network or on the podcast, the economic numbers aren't so rosy when you kind of peel back the onion, for lack, to use another cliche, as if we need another cliche. And I think that, companies need to be very conservative in what they do. And I think people, look, I would just be at this point thankful that I had a job, that I kept my job, that it didn't disrupt my life. I mean, a lot of people, there are people who lost jobs completely, people that have been furloughed, and people that actually lost parts of their wages over this. And though we've gotten 10 million jobs back, whatever the number is, I can't remember what you reported to us, Devin, last week, but it's a great sign, but we've got a ways to go.
Yeah, no, absolutely. As you said, when we kind of look under the surface at the permanence of job losses and the permanent effects that have started, especially in industries not directly affected by the virus, that is quite concerning. On this topic of promotions and doing well at work, of course, we're still LinkedIn. And one of our most popular topics was the work from home leaders that we value most. So what kinds of skills, excuse me, during this work from home period are really standing out? And this was a study done by the Journal of Business and Psychology that we featured that found, instead of flocking to the so-called talkers that we flock to in-person interaction, so those who, display confidence and who are extroverted and who are charming, the journal is saying that during this time, we're more inclined to align with doers, people who are organized, people who are productive, and who we know will get the job done. And as I said, the study has really found that latter category, people who are dependable, who get the job done, are doing better in the workplace right now in terms of raises, in terms of promotions, in terms of confidence by themselves and admiration by their teams. They're doing generally better than those talkers. And it's kind of funny because, when you think more closely about it, that is certainly kind of the personality traits we're drawn to in-person interactions, those who are charming and extroverted. And that doesn't carry much weight in this period when we're not around other people and where just getting the job done, being organized, being dependable is most important. So some kind of practical advice, I hope, for those who are, thinking about their performance reviews right now. So
less talk, more work, and less Zoom, Skype, Google Meets, Microsoft Teams meetings. Is that what I'm hearing?
I would be on board with that. We're in so many Zoom meetings and there's so much talking going on. At the end of the day, you just have to get the job done. You have to be reliable. You have to be dependable.
I love it. And there'll be plenty of time. I guess you could have like a Zoom meeting for water cooler talk. Like, hey, everyone meet me by the virtual water cooler in 3 minutes and log on here.
That's important every now and then. The virtual happy hour. Absolutely. I think that's still important.
Absolutely.
I know I'm going long this time, Jeff, but
that's
an important final topic I'm going to mention was a piece by Karen Mills that we featured. Karen, as you may know, was the former head of the SBA, the Small Business Administration. And as we all know, small businesses could use as much advice and help as they can get right now. Karen wrote a great piece that we featured, which is 3 moves that small business owners can take right now to just, improve their situation. Number 1 is finding customers where they are. So focusing on social media and email campaigns to reach your customers. They are much more online. They're much more on social platforms right now. She says a lot of small businesses are not thinking about that. Number 2 is scrutinizing every cost. She says every dollar matters right now. You should be thinking about renegotiating contracts with landlords, with suppliers. You should be thinking about refinancing debt if you have it. So she says that's very important. And then the third one she mentions is concentrating on the best profit opportunities. She says small business owners have to identify their most valuable products and services right now and really eliminate everything else. So, if you're a restaurant, it may be your menu items that have the strongest gross profit margins. Whatever it is, you need to focus and pare down and, cut the fat and just improve your focus. And then the last thing she mentions, not for business owners, but for the government, she says, of course, programs like the Paycheck Protection Program need to be replenished, but they also need to be redesigned, she says, not from the ground up, but just more easily understood, more easily accessible for those who need it most. She points to the evidence that we've all seen that aid went to wealthier, more well-connected applicants, in some cases public companies.
Yeah.
She says that really needs to change. She says especially minority owned businesses, they were twice as likely to be rejected in their applications. So she just needs, she says the government needs to really redesign it to ensure that those who need it most can understand it and can access it.
Yeah, amen. I don't know why it has to be so complicated. It almost seems like the Rubik's Cube was on purpose in order to confuse people.
Yeah.
They had to sit and wait for long periods of time. I mean, the PPP, I think in some ways was successful. In other ways, it needs some work. And I think it's not a good example of what I would call a government program. But we'll leave that for another conversation. Devin, it's always a pleasure chatting with you. Enjoy your time with your wife and your family. And we'll talk to you again, not next week, but the following week.
Sounds good, Jeff. Take care.
Bye. Welcome back. Now time to talk healthcare. Joining me on the line, she is the editor of Business Insider's Dispense. She's also the healthcare editor as well for Business Insider, Lydia Ramsey. Hi, Lydia. Welcome back to the program.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's always great talking with you. And, you've got your pulse on, pun intended, of course, on what's happening in healthcare. So what's top of mind for you and the team at BI this week?
Yeah, for sure. Certainly one of the biggest things we've been keeping our eye out on is, there's a couple of vaccines that are in later stage development for fighting the coronavirus. And one of them, AstraZeneca, has had a bit of a stumble this week. The company, the trial on hold, as it seemed a participant who had gotten the vaccine had a neurologic kind of symptom or like a side effect that might have happened. So while they're trying to figure out whether or not it is a side effect or if it's just like total coincidence that this person got, quite sick, that's what they still need to figure out. So the tricky thing is that this is a good news if you're looking at it from a scientific perspective. It means, we're being really rigorous. We're taking our time. We're stopping things when we need to take a second and figure it out. But what does stink is that, it does set back our when we might get full data, like this trial has to stop and it might have to stop for a few weeks. Mm-hmm. And the CEO said that they could get a vaccine still by the end of the year. But, it's always, with the whole world watching.
Yeah.
So any delay is a big one.
Yeah. I mean, that obviously everyone's watching and disappointing, but you're absolutely right. I mean, this is what trials are about, and we don't want to rush into distributing something that A, doesn't work, or B, works but also contributes to another illness down the line. That just does not make sense. So hopefully they'll be able to analyze and find the right data and determine whether or not it's contingent on this vaccine.
Yeah, absolutely.
So what else is going on? I mean, I know there's a lot of mergers. I know that data is obviously going to be very important. I'm perusing today's edition of BI's Dispense. I mean, there's clearly a lot going on beyond just vaccines in healthcare.
Yeah, absolutely. So, it's been a big week. Obviously, a lot of companies are getting, the economy has taken a turn, but a lot of healthcare-focused companies have managed to raise significant funding in the past couple months. We're seeing in the next couple of weeks, we should see companies like American Well, which does telehealth. They might go up for a public offering. GoodRx, they're known for coupons that help you kind of control the price of prescription drugs. They're also looking to go public. So it's a really interesting time. And, most recently, a company called Grail, which is an early cancer detection company backed by folks like Jeff Bezos, they're also looking to do an initial public offering. And so that should be really interesting to see how those kind of shake out. We've seen a couple IPOs so far this year in the healthcare space. most recently with Oak Street Health. And that went really, well for the company. It got to like a $9 billion valuation the first day of trading, all for its business of primary care clinics. So it's an interesting time to be in the investment space here in healthcare.
Yeah, and look, I mean, we've learned so much over this pandemic from the pandemic itself, but also we've had to adapt our treatments. I mean, you've talked before about telehealth. You've talked about even before the pandemic about Walmart, CVS, and others stepping up to offer clinics and assistance. So it seems like it's just in a very, very interesting time for innovation and thinking about ways to do things better. So hopefully there will be some positivity that comes out of all this, when we look back years later.
Totally. Yeah. And the other kind of interesting thing I've been zooming in on is I've over the summer been working on this story about a group called the Employer Health Innovation Roundtable. I've totally botched that name, but it's EHIR for short. And
okay.
it's a group that kind of creates these cohorts of employers, so big employers like Google and Disney and Walmart and Boeing. They bring them together for these kind of textile pitches with healthcare startups. So alums include folks like Livongo, which obviously just got acquired, and other folks like Progeny, which went public last year. A lot of folks kind of trying to crack into the employer-funded healthcare space. So I took a closer look at this club because it was not one I'd ever heard of. It's pretty exclusive. It sounds like it's a pretty intense vetting process to get picked to be one of the presenters. But the stakes are pretty interesting. It's an interesting setup where you kind of come out of it and the companies like the Googles and Boeings of the world, they have to kind of commit to saying, okay, we'll test out one of the presenting companies or at least kind of explore what that might look like. So it's kind of interesting to take a step back and hear about like a secret group that I hadn't heard about before.
It's almost
you can find that on Business Insider.
Yeah, it's almost like Shark Tank in a way, right? I mean, in a way, it's like
Yep.
people have to buy in, and hopefully they're not as brutal as some of those people. I haven't watched it in a while, but when I did watch it, those people were exceptionally brutal on that program. So hopefully they're a little bit nicer. And, some of that's probably done for TV.
For sure. And yeah, it's one of those things too where the companies kind of vote on which ones they want to see perform. So they're already a little bit interested by the time they get in the door.
That's true. Well, Lydia, always a pleasure chatting with you again. People should check out Business Insider's Dispensed. It's an excellent aggregation of all the important news of the week. I check it out every day. Lydia, pleasure talking with you. Enjoy your weekend, and we look forward to having you back on the program very soon. Welcome back. Now time to talk markets. Joining me on the line is the co-founder of Delphi Digital cryptocurrency research firm and former equity strategist, and he wears multiple hats on this show, Mr. Kevin Kelly. Hey, Kevin.
How you doing, Jeff?
I'm doing okay. It's great to talk with you. I hope you had a great short week, although it didn't feel short because I think we crammed Monday into Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday.
Yeah, I was going to say, especially in crypto where these markets trade 24/7, there's no such thing really as a U.S. holiday for better or worse.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's start with markets. A lot of volatility this week. I know things were down, then they were up, then they were down again. We got some more economic information, but give us your assessment as an equity strategist and someone who's out there talking with institutional investors.
Yeah, so I mean, you saw, to your point, volatility certainly has remained pretty elevated, not just in the VIX, but you're looking at which tracks the S&P 500, but across the Nasdaq with tech stocks. You're also seeing, I think what's really interesting or something that's top of mind for us is looking at the kind of 1 month volatility contracts, I guess you could say, versus the 3 month or even the 6 month, looking out a bit further. And what's really kind of interesting that's been taking place for the last week or so is you're starting to see the spread for kind of longer dated calls on volatility start to widen. And so basically what that means is people are essentially, or investors are essentially starting to really, I think, price in or prep for a potentially volatile next couple months. Obviously, you got the big U.S. presidential election that's really going to be top of mind for everybody, starting probably in the next month or so. But what it's telling us is that, I don't think necessarily this bout of volatility is behind us. And I think, even historically, if you just look at seasonality, this is one of the more volatile periods as you have people coming back from Labor Day and coming back to the desk. So, it's not, again, not investment advice, not saying go out and sell anything, but I do think that investors should be prepared for certainly a volatile couple months as we close out what has already been an incredibly volatile 2020.
Yeah, I mean, and I was talking to someone who will be appearing on the network tomorrow, Dr. David Kelly, and I think what's interesting is, he kind of likened the first half and the second half to a marathon. And I don't want to give away exactly what we talked about because people have to tune in tomorrow. But he said, the second half of running a marathon is a lot harder than the first for obvious reasons, right? Because you got to pace yourself. You still have 13 more miles to go, 13.1 miles to go, and it's a lot more challenging. And I think he was using that analogy when it relates to adding back the jobs, the millions of jobs that were lost. We had a great run thus far, but that's only 48% of the jobs that we've gotten back. So there's clearly going to be more volatility and a lot more effort. And do we get back to normal in 2020 or do we get back to normal in 2021? That's really the fundamental question. Sorry.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. I think, building off of that, I think what's also important to keep top of mind, it's not necessarily, again, to make any type of trade or investment strategy, but something to be aware of to put what could potentially happen in the next couple of months in context. So if we do see another, bout of volatility, or you see the VIX spike and things like this, listeners can kind of put some context around why that might be happening. One thing that as you head into every year end, it's important to note how well or how poor markets have been doing in any given year, because if you're looking at, this year, back in March, obviously everyone thought this would be the worst year we'd seen in literally decades. And now that we've seen such an extensive rebound in asset prices, and there's a handful of reasons why we've seen that, and we've gone over them on this show countless times. But the point being, understanding where, if you're an institutional investor, or you're somebody running it, you're an equity PM, and you're looking at your book right now and saying, okay, we've kind of almost managed to make it out of 2020 relatively unscathed, right? It's not to say that every asset has bounced back, but compared to where we were in March, I don't think a lot of people thought that we would be where we are today. That's another reason for people to potentially get defensive going into year end, especially if we start to see more volatility, which again could kind of keep a cap on asset prices here in the short term, right? So just a kind of quick thought about why we might start to see, portfolios or investors shift a bit more defensive. It's almost a kind of this capital preservation mentality to preserve what little gains you've made, if you have made gains this year, because the downside that we saw in March was just so drastic. I think there's still a lot of people who have scars from that.
Yeah, I think, and they will, and there are people
Yeah.
that are younger people that went through 2008 and are going through this, and they're going to have double scars, that are going to frame how they invest in the future. Kevin, let's talk a little bit about cryptocurrency, because crypto has been in the news. We've talked about it throughout our show, both here on the podcast and on the network. But give us your latest sentiment of what's going on in that world right now.
Yeah, tying it to everything we're talking about here, if you expect volatility in traditional markets to remain pretty elevated, at least for the next 12 months or through year end, in terms of the large caps like the Bitcoins of the world, it can potentially again keep a cap on them as well, because like we've talked about, elevated volatility typically not a good sign for Bitcoin. What I will say though, and again this comes with a very kind of fat disclaimer, or I need to preface with, still an extremely risky market. What I do think though is that there are pockets or sectors of this market that are now emerging that are the correlations between them, these assets or these subsectors, and your large caps like your Bitcoins are starting to break down, because I think the market is becoming a bit more mature in terms of where capital is being deployed. And so, I encourage people to just start to read about this stuff, start to look into it, because I really do, every day that we see a new project come across our desk, or a new potential investment pop up, we're constantly evaluating that against what our kind of base case, or what our core themes are, I guess you could say, and even our core themes of what we think will be successful going forward are being tweaked and are being changed just based on the kind of innovation, the rapid innovation that's happening in this space. So long story short, I think crypto is not only here to stay, but is going to be one of the places in which investors eventually, even your non-crypto investors, your traditional investors, eventually start to shift some of their portfolios, their assets into, because if you think about what the growth profile of just about any asset class is, aside from, really outside of emerging market equities over the next 5-10 years, it's really not a great growth profile. That above average growth profile you find within this crypto and digital asset space. And so there's just so much going on that it's almost impossible at this point, I think, to wrap, to have, let's say, a 5-minute segment and say, here's everything that, is possibly going on in this space, because there is just such a, I'll say, divergence between, kind of your haves and your have-nots, and the companies or the projects that are building and having success and finding, product market fit versus those that aren't. So it's becoming a very diversified space.
And, is there any movement, thank you for that, Kevin, any movement in terms of the regulatory apparatus, what's happening in Congress? I've been reading some stories, and I'm not the expert that you are, clearly, but I've been reading stories where, the federal government here in the U.S. is like, okay, well, we need to do some more looking into crypto assets, cryptocurrency. We see the Federal Reserve, I think, really looking at digital assets. And you look at some of our global competitors. I know North Korea, China are really making getting some distance from others in that space. So any thoughts about where we head as a nation, as we head from a regulatory apparatus?
From my standpoint, I've always been a big advocate for, obviously free markets. And that's not to say that you need to, I think regulation is great, will be long-term great for the crypto space, right? You have to put some type of parameters around this, but within those parameters, I do think that the U.S. could, the difficulty for the U.S. right now, to be frank, is if you look at, again, if you talk about growth profiles, right, the U.S. is kind of on the back nine in a lot of ways, right? You look at just demographics, you look at where we're kind of spending money or where we're wasting money, where we're kind of investing. And I think the investment in innovation goes way beyond just, wanting to be kind of tech first. I think that's the way in which the U.S. actually can potentially stay, atop the global food chain, I guess you could say. And so my personal stance is I think that there should be, a really truly dedicated group that becomes larger and actually oversees this space, but also is working within the confines and understands at a very intimate level how regulating of space like crypto is different from regulating just traditional tech, right? Because there are a lot of different nuances. And so to answer your question, kind of long story short, not a ton on the regulatory front. Yes, the SEC continues to look into what we consider, fraudulent projects or scams, because those do exist, have existed, they exist in every market.
Yep.
But I think more broadly speaking, in order for the U.S. to stay really kind of out in front from a competitive standpoint, the regulatory arbitrage aspect of people going elsewhere to be able to, finance or fund some of these crypto projects and really start to build up what we think the next generation of tech is going to look like. If the U.S. falls behind on that, then, it's to the detriment of the entire economy, not necessarily just, the specific subsector of crypto, I guess you could say.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Kevin, we're going to have to leave it there. Really interesting conversation. Really glad that you can wear both hats, break it down for us. Have a great weekend, and we'll catch up with you again next week.
Thanks, Jeff. Have a great one.
Bye-bye. Welcome back on Time to Talk Real Estate. Joining me on the line, Dow Jones Market Watch's Jacob Passy, the real estate reporter there. Hey, Jacob, how are you?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing quite good. Survived the rainstorm we had the last couple of days, and things are looking sunny as you and I are talking. So I'm very optimistic about nice weather for the weekend.
Yeah.
So what's top of mind this week as you look at the real estate market?
Yeah. So a few different things. So first off, mortgage rates fell to another record low. You and I talk about them all the time.
I feel it's like Groundhog Day.
I know exactly. So it's the new all-time low is stunning 2.86% for the 30-year fixed-rate mortgage. That's the average according to Freddie Mac. But this week I looked at it a little critically because, while that is a super low interest rate and obviously, a boon to folks who are still looking to refinance perhaps, or folks who are, hoping to buy a home. Not all Americans will have access to those low rates. And so I kind of looked at it this week from that angle, looking at the folks who are less likely to be offered a rate that low. And there was a recent report from Lending Tree that looked at how Black Americans in particular, are offered significantly higher rates than, the overall population. So their study, they looked at, the likelihood that, a Black home buyer will be offered a high-cost mortgage. So that's a mortgage where the APR is higher than the benchmark rate set by the Federal Financial Institutions Examination Council, which is like an overseeing body. And so they found that, this ranges across the country, but they found that the share of Black buyers who received high-cost home loans was nearly 9 percentage points higher than the overall population. And in places like Cleveland, over 1 in 4 Black home buyers were offered a high-cost mortgage, whereas the overall population was only 9% of the overall population was offered a high-cost mortgage. So there are racial disparities here. Now, I don't want to, necessarily imply that all of this is, this isn't, necessarily like loan officers, being explicitly racist. There are certainly factors here, at play that, lead to these outcomes. So, Black Americans are less likely to have high credit scores, are less likely to, have as much saved towards a down payment, which can affect the interest rate you're offered and things like that. But it shows how, the kind of economic disparities that we talk a lot about, like in terms of the racial wealth gap and things like that, how those creep into all the financial aspects of one's life. So, if you live in a neighborhood where there aren't many banks offered, so this was another point that the Lending Tree study and other research I examined looked at, was if you live in a neighborhood where there's only 1 or 2 banks, you're not going to necessarily be able to comparison shop as effectively as someone who lives in a neighborhood where there's a bank on every corner. And those factors go a long way towards determining how affordable a mortgage can be. So that was an interesting kind of report I did this week.
Yeah, look, I think it's been exacerbated, Jacob, by this pandemic. People who are at the lower end of the income spectrum have been hit harder for obvious reasons. They've lost their jobs because maybe they're not as skilled in the work that they do, or they're in lower skilled jobs. They don't get the income, so a lot of them have lost a job. And so this is clearly an issue that needs to be resolved. I think we have to work through, because you can't get yourself out of trouble if you're constantly having to pay higher rates. And we just did a story this week on payday lending. I mean, that if you talk about and I'm not saying that I'm not equating that to mortgage lending, but I mean that in a lot of ways that's predatory, because you can never get out from under that payday loan. And
right.
I think if you have a very the cost to borrow is predicated on a lot of things. Your credit, as you said, it's predicated on where you live and all those types of things, and your financial feasibility. But we've got to be able to provide this open platform for people that to compete, get mortgages, have equal treatment under the law, and get opportunity.
Yeah, it's great that you mentioned also the structural aspect. Because the other story I'm actually still working on right now that should be going out today. Today's Friday. That kind of similarly relates to this is a study came out this week that found that neighborhoods that were historically redlined face worse outcomes for COVID-19. Yep. So redlining, for those who are not familiar or may have heard the term before but don't know what it means, following the Great Depression, there was a federal agency that was tasked with determining the riskiness of lending, mortgage lending in different neighborhoods, because a lot of lenders were, hard hit by the Depression, and, they wanted to right-size the ship, so to speak. Unfortunately, those determinations were often made almost entirely on the basis of the racial composition of a neighborhood. So historically, back in the 50s and 60s, like 50s, 40s, in the lead up to the 1960s with the Civil Rights Act and the Fair Housing Act and things like that, which put these practices to bed, there were neighborhoods that were predominantly black were pretty much excluded from mortgage lending. It was pretty much impossible to get a mortgage loan in those neighborhoods. And so as a result, that drove down the homeownership rate among Black Americans. And, because homeownership is the biggest driver of wealth in this country, that is a major contributing factor to the historical wealth gap between Black Americans and white Americans. Mm-hmm. And so, the legacies of that are still playing out in a lot of ways. And this report was really startling to see how it's now playing out in this pandemic. We already knew that Black Americans were more likely to face a negative outcome from COVID, more likely to be hospitalized, to die. And part of that comes down to where they live. A lot of historically redlined neighborhoods are still, majority minority neighborhoods, predominantly, residents of color. And, in those neighborhoods, chronic health conditions like asthma and diabetes are more prevalent, which as a result researchers are finding contributes to higher likelihood of complications related to COVID-19 if you contract it. And so it kind of shows that housing is not, when we're talking about housing policy, we're not just talking about, money and things like that. We're talking about people's lives and health. And it shows how, if we can put policies in place that address some of these historical structural issues, not only will we get people on the path towards financial success, but we'll also get them on the path towards health.
Yeah, I echo what you're saying. And this is a lot more than real estate. This is a lot more than just basic finance. Clearly the scales are tipped against in a lot of ways for a lot of reasons. And I don't think a lot of it's nefarious. I don't think that there was a design to do this. I think it just happened this way. And so part of what we need to do is kind of recalibrate things. And, part of the reason why we do this show, you, I, and other people, we've been doing this show every week for the last 2 years is because we want to provide basic financial information to people and they can consume it. I know that's one of the reasons why you write your columns every week. So you're providing information to readers. I think that's part of it. And I think in some cases, the government needs to get involved to kind of create more, take away some of that disparity.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, Jacob, always a pleasure chatting with you. I think it was awesome topics, really interesting, and we'll chat again with you next week.
Yeah.
Take care. Have a great weekend.
Have a great weekend.
Bye-bye. Take care. Welcome back. Now we're going to break down more retirement news. Joining me on the line, she's the retirement reporter for Dow Jones Market Watch, Alessandro Melito, I should say. I don't know why I say your name wrong. I do that all the time, Allie, but my apologies. Allie, thanks so much for joining us this morning.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing great. Okay, so lots going on in markets, lots going on all across the globe, lots of going on in the U.S. What's going on in your mind in terms of retirement?
Yeah, so this week there was a study that came out, or a survey that came out talking about just overall confidence and retirement plans for Americans. And, as to be expected, some people are feeling the stress of the pandemic more than others. And so the survey just basically doubled down on the fact that a lot of people, they might not have been prepared for retirement prior to COVID-19 emerging, but they're certainly not confident or comfortable or prepared for their retirement now. Mm-hmm. And there are a few groups that suffered or that are suffering more than others, or at least they feel less confident more than others, such as women and people who are closer to retirement. So the people who are closer to retirement are feeling more stressed out about their retirement and their retirement security than people who are actually in retirement. So it just goes to show that having some sort of a plan, even if you can't necessarily follow through if the unexpected happens, could potentially help ease some of the stresses associated with like actually making it to retirement.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think any plan in general, Allie, doesn't go 100% the way it should, right? I mean, whether you're a U.S. Navy SEAL fighting a mission in a foreign country or it's a financial plan, there's always going to be little hiccups or big hiccups along the way that might make you have to change your tactics. But the reality
Yeah.
is you have to have a plan and you got to start somewhere. So I think it's what a lot of people may have learned from this, and I would be curious to get your thoughts about this because you're actually getting readers, people to write to you and you to help solve their issues or give them advice. But if you at least get started, think about when you want to retire, what retirement looks like for you. Do you have a family? Do you not have a family? Do you own a home? Do you not own a home? It's better to do that now than wait until you're 5, 10 years out, and then you've got to work even harder to backfill what you don't have.
Yeah, and there are things that people could do aside from even just saving. So, like, saving is obviously important, but so is, reviewing whatever you do have, making a list of your assets and your liabilities, your debts, and trying to make sense of, like, is there any room in the budget to put a little bit more away? Or if you do have accounts already, say like, you have a 401k through an employer, or you have an IRA, or you're inherited one, or something like that. Look at under the hood, like what's going on under there? Like what are the types of investments that are in those accounts, and like should they be allocated differently because of your time frame or like whatever's been going on? A lot of advisors suggest that if you have a retirement plan with an advisor, you could talk to them, but don't necessarily go and change stuff because brands are building in emergency situations, stock market ups and downs and all that into their plan. But it is still good to know like where you stand and like just to have that in the back of your mind. It does cause it does allow for more comfort or ease in a situation like that.
And clearly, if you're at comfort and ease, you don't have the mental duress that you might have, and mental stress is even in some cases worse than physical stress, right? I mean, it takes a toll. I mean, you've heard horrible stories about people who have been suicidal or gone, really had some major depression issues because of finances or not having what they thought they needed. So this would go a long way to resolving that. Allie, real quick, I had a great conversation on the network on Friday with George Grombacher, and one of the things we talked about were in this kind of new paradigm, not related to COVID, but the new paradigm where people that are working with financial planners, they want to make sure that their financial plans are aligned with their values as individuals. Are you seeing that from your perspective and your coverage where people are saying, not only do I want to be able to save money for my retirement or for some goal, but I want to make sure that my money is invested prudently in something that I believe in, whether it's environmental, social, or governance related?
Yeah. I mean, that has been something that has been, that's been a trend that's been growing over time, just this concept of like social investing and picking companies or funds that promote your same values. So yeah, I have seen that grow in recent years. I never really like looked too carefully into it, but I do know that like there are a lot of financial advisors who are starting to specialize in that too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Cool.
I was gonna say. I mean, I think, and I guess the reason why I brought it up is, and I think that there's evolution that's happening in the financial services space, not only within products but also how you service clients. And it's not just younger people that are values investors or doing things based on their values, but it's people of all generations, whether they're boomers, whether they're my age, Gen Xers or Gen Y or Gen Z. So, it's interesting to see how the financial services industry and the advisors will continue to adapt there.
Yeah, it's actually really cool how like some funds will pick companies that, for example, maybe like, no animal cruelty or like no animal testing whatsoever. Animal cruelty is always bad, but like no animal testing whatsoever. Or others that are very like heavily focused on like Christian values or some like
Sure.
funds earmarked for like Christianity. It's really cool, and it is growing. I'm sure there are going to be so many different types of like values-based investment options for people in the future, especially as like the trend picks up.
Yeah, especially with the due diligence that you're going to have to do, and whether or not, and within a retirement plan, making sure that it aligns, those values align, the value of the employer aligns with the values of the employees, because that's not always the case where, we all think differently and we may, that may not have been discussed. Well, Allie, we're going to have to leave it there. Really appreciate you stopping by the show, or at least stop driving for the show, and appreciate you coming on, and wish you a great weekend, and we'll talk to you again next week.
Yes, thank you too.
Bye-bye.
Snoop Doggy and Dr. Dre is at the dope, ready to make an entrance, so back on live. Before I have to pull the strap up.
Welcome back, and now we're going to talk to our friends on Capitol Hill, the Legal Eagles. Joining me on the line, David Levine, Kevin Walsh. Both are principals with the Groom Law Group, an employee benefits law firm based in Washington, D.C. Gentlemen, how are you?
We're doing well, Jeff. Thanks for having us on. With kind of the pandemic continuing, the days just seem to blend together, and I feel like we might have just had this conversation moments ago.
It does. I do have that flashback, that Groundhog Day. But David, lots going on. We've talked regs. What's top of mind for you and the Eagles this week?
Sure, and given and it is like Groundhog Day, because for the listeners, we took a couple takes to get to this part this week. But I think out of the box, we've talked a lot about regs. So let's talk about litigation. It's interesting. I had a recent discussion with a bunch of folks saying, well, what do we talk about on litigation? Because it feels like Groundhog Day. Every single day, it seems like there is a new lawsuit filed. And ironically, in some cases, almost every single one is between 46 and 48 pages long. It's like they're almost identical at times. And so the question that the listeners might say is, then why are we talking about it? Because we're not going to talk about individual cases, because boy, is it mind-numbing to repeat the same story over and over. But let's talk about a couple things that are going on here. We've talked about some of this before, but it's good just to do a quick touch base. Number one, the lawsuits continue to proliferate by the number of firms bringing them. The old core players that we saw even 5-7 years ago, there's a lot of new players in the game. Number two, fiduciary insurance, prices going up in a lot of cases, and there's a lot of questions to be dealt with on that. Number three, it's also important to recognize that in many cases, you'll have multiple plaintiffs' firms circling around your plan or your services at this point. Number four, what's really changed? Well, Kevin and I love to talk about data and privacy and security. As we've said before, there's no authority saying data is a plan asset, but the plaintiffs are still hammering pretty hard on this at this point. And they're really digging deep into products. So we live in a world now, and I think we've used this word many times, is blender products, where you have many providers inside a product. I'm not going to talk about a specific lawsuit because we're involved in some of these. But the plaintiff's bar is saying, why do you have all these different players, and why are people getting paid, and why didn't you do something else? It's 2020 hindsight is a lot of the perspective. But the plaintiff's bar are smart people, and they're coming up with very creative theories. They've moved on to PEOs and MEPs. We're involved in a lot of that world, so it's very interesting. So what's the takeaway? The takeaway for me, and then I'll flip it to Kevin, is as follows. My favorite phrase, whack-a-mole, comes back to life. Look at these lawsuits. If they're focused on data, they're focused on ancillary services, whether it's managed accounts or cross-selling or other things. The plaintiff's theories we don't agree with, but at the same time, having a process in place can help you to say, we looked at this, and this is why we're okay with it. It doesn't mean you need to say no to everything, but it also means maybe having some more processes around these things in the lawsuits that I just mentioned could be a good idea. I think that's, as you head into fall for your fall resolutions, that could be a good thing to do with your committees as you look forward. Kevin, you probably have some great insights, so I'll toss it to you.
I mean, I think you hit on kind of the big picture item, which is that, these lawsuits are proliferating, and it seems like if you're a plan fiduciary, if you're an asset manager for a plan, whatever you do, you're going to get sued for some reason. At this point, it seems like, and I think these are pretty thin reads, a lot of these claims. But as you said, the plaintiff's bar is getting more and more creative. And so to me, what that signals is that having fiduciary insurance, having insurance in place is a big deal. And we've seen a lot of insurers recently begin to try to find ways to update their documents so that they're not quite as on the hook for some of these novel claims. So it just, if you're out getting fiduciary insurance, I try to think of the 3 C's of insurance coverage, which is, what's the cost, what does it cover, and what are the caps? So, when the takeaway here would be, while you're trying to figure out what type of claim you might face, it's also worth revisiting your insurance policies, taking a look at them, and thinking about those 3 C's.
Gentlemen, one question I have before we end the segment, and that is there are any steps being taken to curtail any of these lawsuits? So some of these lawsuits may have merit, right? I mean, and that we're not dismissing that, but with any type of legal proceeding, there could be frivolous cases, things that people are just hunting around for money. And I know in other realms, not necessarily retirement, but in healthcare and others, there has been a movement, at least in the Congress, for curtailing some of that with caps, I think, or something like that. Is there anything that, this is a big deal. Is there anything that the Department of Labor or the Congress or anyone else who oversees retirement plans might think about in this regard?
Well, I'll give one comment. I'm sure Kevin has it. Sure, we could try to do litigation caps, but it's to go back, I think, to the Supreme Court decision on company stock in 2014 in Dudenhofer that was the big case. Mm-hmm. You're trying to really distinguish the meritorious cases from not. It's really hard to do it. Mm-hmm. I would argue that
David, come on. You're not going to say the sheep from the goats?
I was trying to actually speak in English.
Come on. That's what the case says.
Yeah, the sheep from the meritorious goats. Okay, but putting that aside, I think there's also another thing. I don't have that much hope that the DOL will weigh in here. I think they don't want to be in the middle of this, mm-hmm. per se, and also to pick up Kevin's favorite topic. Given how the department has fixated on missing participants in some of these matters and spent inordinate amounts of sums on, checks of $1.
Wait, so are we turning this into a 45-minute segment, David?
Yeah, I was just making my comment. I'm making my commentary, Kevin. Tell me if you disagree.
No, I agree with what you're saying. I think the way that this will get checked is that courts will see more of these theories get tested. So, yep. As defendants get tired of settling, or if the kind of the plaintiff's bar starts getting too greedy in asking for settlement prices, a lot of these theories will get tested, and that will either lead to changes among plan fiduciary behavior, or it will kind of make it not worth the while for the plaintiff's bars to bring some of these claims that kind of stretch credulity.
Yeah, look, I think it's interesting, and I think, I think it's something that people obviously need to be thinking about, and I'd say I could see fiduciary meetings, committee meetings stretching from the usual 2.5, 3 hours to now 4 or 5 hours as a result of some of the due diligence that they're going to need to do in some of these ancillary services and data concepts you're thinking about. Well, gentlemen, we're going to leave it there. Look, it's a great way to end the show every week with you both because it's intellectually stimulating and it's entertaining as well. Thank you both so much. Have a wonderful weekend, and we will talk to you again next week.
Thank you,
thanks for having us on. And if we need to, we can record this again and again.
Bye, guys. Take care. Well, that wraps up this episode of the BRN Sunday podcast. I want to thank all of our great contributors for stopping by and analyzing the news with us. And I want to thank you, the audience, for also stopping by. You're the reason why we do this each and every week. Don't forget, we're back again tomorrow, Monday, for BRN AM. I'll be joined by JP Morgan's Dr. David P. Kelly, I should say. So until then, I'm Jeff Snyder. Stay safe, keep on saving, and don't forget, roll with the changes.